Do you think the lawmakers that came up with this law have worked a day in their life in e-commerce?
No, but then and you know what? I bet you the lobbyists that are talking to them also have not worked a day in their life in e-commerce.
Yeah. The practical application of this is just...
No. So much of this is driven in our industry in general, e-commerce, cross-border e-commerce, when the brokers, I'm going to blame brokers. I think when brokers sometimes get involved in these things, they don't understand e-commerce really well. And they want to be so everything's compliance, right? It's all about compliant, and there's a de minimis for a reason, and they miss common sense of this is an e-commerce shipment. Like, let's not overthink this. And a lot of this stuff gets overthought because there are some really, really smart people out there that are too smart for their own good. We've worked with some, we know some out there in the industry that, they are smart. And then you say, okay, yeah, that all is true, but it doesn't really apply or shouldn't apply in cross-border e-commerce. Like, this can be so much simpler. Welcome to today's episode of the Zonos Decoding Cross-Border Ecommerce podcast. I'm your host, Clint Reid, here alongside me with my co-host, Aaron Bezzant. And before we get things kicked off, we love to spice things up a bit. Aaron's been, prepping to talk about tax. Like, what?
I've been doing a lot of prep, actually.
Okay, so all right, tell me about the prep. What do you have ready for us?
All right, so I've been looking into a lot of different horrible tax jokes to kick this off. That's the type of prep you're talking about, right?
Oh, of course.
Dad.
What else would be
some sort of dad joke is
yeah.
what I'm thinking. The one I landed on here was, why did the coin go to the tax office?
Why?
Because I wanted to make sense of the tax code. Ba-da-ba.
Well, we're here today to help make sense of cross-border tax. In specific, this episode is about low-value tax schemes for cross-border e-commerce. However, there really isn't a great way to encompass everything because the U.S. might not fall under that categorization. But that's what we're going to talk about, everything with e-commerce related to tax. This is super exciting, right? The most
Absolutely.
exciting. Right. Okay. But before we talk about it, I want to ask you about the history of tax, how it's been collected, and what's kind of changed in e-commerce and when. So let's back up. E-commerce shipment is sent 10 years ago. How is tax typically collected on a cross-border shipment?
Well, it's the same in every single country, which is when it clears customs. U.S. is a little exception to that.
Okay. Yep.
And I'll let you touch on the U.S. a bit, but really it says it's clearing customs. They look, it's assessed for duty and tax, depending on if it's above or below the de minimis, but it's all handled during the clearance process, and then it's collected from the recipient, right? Or is billed back to the shipper or to a third party like Zonos, but it's all assessed at the time of clearance.
Pretty simple.
Super simple.
Funnels through customs. Customs takes care of everything, and then or the broker, and then it gets billed back. It gets billed to the correct party.
And when I say simple, it's complicated when you think of all the different countries and different rules and things they have. But the process of actual collecting it is the same. Look,
about 5-6 years ago, I would have asked you if it was simple, you would have said, no, it's super complicated.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when I ask you looking back 5 years ago, you say,
it was simple. It was.
Okay, so let's get going here. Want to talk about U.S. and Australia, sorry, and what I think that might be a good place to start historically. Let's go back a little bit, and I can jump in a little bit here too, and then we'll jump into some of the other countries. But today we want to cover U.S., Australia, New Zealand, UK, Europe, Norway, Singapore, and maybe Brazil. Maybe
we can touch on what's going on in Brazil too. Yeah.
All right. So
where do you want to start?
How'd this get started? Why are we even having? Why is this episode even necessary? Who did this to us?
People that want their money. That's who did this to us.
Lawmakers.
Yep. Let's be clear.
Lawyers too, actually. Right?
This is all about.
You know what? Can we? No, we probably can't. I was hoping we could just blame North Dakota, right?
We could, but the stuff in Australia was going on at the same time. So, and I think actually, I think globally, people, the other countries paid more attention to Australia than they did.
Yeah, you're probably right.
The stuff
because U.S. was a little bit different thing.
I think so. Even though it really ended up being the same thing, or very similar, it wasn't viewed that way. I don't believe.
So 5 years ago, 2018.
That's 6
February.
years ago now.
Holy cow! What happened? 6 years ago, 2018. A orders going from California to, let's say, New York or North Dakota. Was tax collected? No. Okay. So this wasn't happening.
It was supposed to be. Do you know where the tax was supposed to be accounted for?
Oh, it was on top. It was. No, don't tell me. It was owed by the recipient. They were supposed to self-report. So they were supposed to say, I bought all this stuff on Amazon. I'm going to self-report and pay tax on this in my, to my state. That was how it was supposed to be working, right?
Yeah. On my annual tax returns, I'm supposed to list all the sales I had from out of state and then pay the sales tax at that time. Yeah. And that's, I'm sure that happened on everybody's tax returns, right?
Yeah. No one's. No.
And by the way, we need to give credit where credit's due. It was South Dakota.
Darn it.
Yeah.
Okay. I almost want to rewind and go back and say South Dakota.
No, this is all confusing and hard to keep track of. It was a Dakota, but it's the South Dakota.
All right. Yep. Wayfair versus South Dakota. Mm-hmm. Even though Australia happened first, but Australia kind of fits under that low value tax scheme bucket.
Yeah.
And as we talk about today, Wayfair versus South Dakota and the impact of that, I think we'll really focus on, we'll talk about it generally. We're not the experts on this by any stretch, but we are really good at it, at how it impacts the customers outside the United States.
Right.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. Talk to me a little bit here. So what was going on and why did this get started? Why even, look, maybe I can just, ramble for a minute about this, but I think what happened was, and correct me if I'm wrong, North Dakota, right, is...
You mean South?
South Dakota is sues because they want to force Wayfair, an online retailer, to collect tax versus, the recipients inside of South Dakota having to pay the tax or self-report. And the Supreme Court ruled, it was later in the year, right? It was in June?
In June of 2018 is when the
June of 2018
Yep.
ruled that
it was a 5-4 vote, so it wasn't like a landslide either.
Yeah, geez. So South Dakota can force anyone outside their jurisdiction to register for a tax ID and have to pay directly and self-report from the seller. The seller would have to self-report and pay, not the recipient.
And it's for larger sellers, right? So it wasn't going to be required for it, but someone who's selling a certain amount of goods into South Dakota.
Yeah. And then we still have this today where every state, so if you're outside the United States and you're looking to sell in the United States, you don't necessarily have to remit tax into every single state unless you're using a provider that is like an e-commerce platform, like an Amazon, right? They're going to do it. Or if you're using, we'll talk about this in another episode, a merchant of record service, right? Someone that is acting as like the seller of the goods, you're going to have to remit tax to every single state if you use someone like that. But I'll touch on that on a few different examples on this episode. It's not too much of a distraction, but it's important because if you are managing your own exports and selling internationally and using someone like Zonos, you can take advantage of being under the threshold in certain states and not having nexus. And then in others where nexus. Okay. All right. So nexus is that state's rules that determine whether or not you need to get a tax ID, right? Typically, people, I think, often think of nexus as having a physical location there.
Which it is.
Yes. But you're not physically there, right? You do have to get a tax ID and essentially remit. Did I get that? How'd I do?
Yeah. No, there's nexus of if you're physically established in that state, then you're going to be doing sales tax there, right? Or there's economic nexus, which is selling thresholds based on number of transactions or volume or amount of revenue that's being sold into that state. And each state has its own rules, which we don't have time to go into on this. But so you don't turn on all 50 states at the same time. You turn them on as you hit the
nexus. Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, this is why, though, I wanted to attempt talking about the U.S. Aaron is our in-house resident expert. Actually, we have a couple of us. A couple team members here as it relates to low value tax and e-commerce. So that was a good answer.
Yeah, no, and experts, let's use that loosely because being an expert on every single one of these schemes is difficult to do.
Well,
right?
So I thought it'd be important to Google, right? So I Googled like low value cross-border tax schemes before this in prep, and it's all our documentation, right?
So
we're at the top of the list, right? Yep. Go to Zonos. We have a lot of documentation on this. And a team that is dealing, with this for our retailers. And because we are not the merchant of record, it's really important that we help them monitor when they trigger nexus in the U.S. if they're outside the U.S. or they trigger a threshold that will require them to remit tax into a specific country, which we'll get to in just a second. Yeah. Now, fast forwarding to today. I think U.S. retailers are now very used to having to deal with this, right? I mean, there's a big growth in tax companies like Avalara and some others that helped with U.S. sales tax. And then, but how did this impact merchants outside the United States that are shipping to the United States?
Well, that's the interesting part about it is this whole thing was really all about interstate commerce, and it would affect that shipment from California to New York. And so me as a consumer here in the US, I started seeing sales tax getting charged on my online orders when I was buying from different companies here inside the US. But the law wasn't written to say, hey, from one state to another. It was any transactions outside of South Dakota. And it's evolved into any state, outside of that state. So it impacts everyone globally. I don't know if it was necessarily seen that way right out of the gate. But it really impacts anyone in the world selling into the U.S. You've got to watch your thresholds.
Well, I mean, we've talked with merchants that are have not gotten registered into the states that are outside the United States and are facing, pretty substantial back taxes, right? That they need to deal with or self-declare and hopefully or notify, right, that they're hey, I'm about to register and cut me a little bit of a break. But these are some significant amounts. The U.S. is, because of our low de minimis, we have a ton of e-commerce volume coming into the U.S. And I would say that there's still a large number of retailers that are not yet complying with the U.S. law.
I would think so.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, kind of to touch on how this worked 10 years ago. The U.S. doesn't collect sales tax on import. It's always been collected at the state level through these now nexus laws and things. So the U.S. is not even a low value tax law. It's sales tax.
And the U.S. is the only country in the world where tax has never, as far as I understand, right? Like sales tax has never historically ever been collected by customs because it's a state level sales tax. And it's typically only been paid when you're in the state, right? Or and so the Wayfair thing changed it. But what didn't change is the U.S. still does not collect sales tax on imports. Customs does not broker. It's not due to customs. It's always just due to the state. It's the only country like that.
And customs just deals with duty and other import fees, and that's it.
Yeah.
Sales tax has always been meant to be remitted directly to each individual state.
Yeah.
So, and we start thinking about why this is happening, and why changes we're seeing so many rapid changes over the last, let's say 10 years, because honestly, these conversations were happening way before these laws were ever enacted. But it's a boom of e-commerce.
Yeah, it's a shift from brick and mortar, right, where it was easy to collect sales tax brick and mortar to e-commerce.
Yep, that's it. And then it turned into lost revenue.
Yeah, not just for the states, but for
countries.
Countries,
right? now a larger percentage of the goods that consumers are buying are coming in cross-border. And with de minimis values and other things, they're seeing a loss in revenue as well as a competitive disadvantage for their local businesses.
I'm glad you brought that up, because that competitive disadvantage, which did apply state to state a little bit, right? For sure.
Absolutely.
You were putting, but man, at a country level, what country was most exposed for tax, a tax disadvantage to their local, to their local companies there?
Australia.
$1,000 de minimis. Imagine all the goods coming in from China, US, all these sellers selling into Australia when it's under 1,000, not having to pay tax, which still does happen today, which we can touch on. So Australia actually started use again before the whole Wayfair thing, or during the same time, right? There's people, these countries, they're trying to figure out how to get their money. And Australia came out with a law, which is to collect GST or for companies outside of the, outside of their jurisdiction to register for GST, but it doesn't apply to all of them. So talk to me a little bit about Australia. Yeah. How does the Australia low value tax scheme work? And also, how does it work when it's not low value, right? Let's go through that.
No, that's a good segue into this, which is, they saw a massive hole in their tax revenue and in the competitiveness of their local businesses. And it was interesting to watch before, if I rewind 10 plus years, I was at an e-commerce seller, and guess what? Australia was a big lane for us, right? Because we could sell in there duty and tax free for pretty much all of our shipments. We had, we very rarely did we have a high value shipment. And I heard rumblings for years about them lowering the de minimis because they had to stop the bleeding somehow,
stop the bleeding. But what would be the consequence if they lowered the de minimis? Like what are the trade-offs there?
Well, now they also have to increase the staff and resources needed to actually assess and collect that duty and tax. And you get a diminishing rate of return when you're trying to collect tax on a very low value shipment. It often doesn't justify the resources needed to do that. And so nothing ever really happened. And then someone got the bright idea in Australia to say, hey, you know what? What if we put the burden of assessing and collecting and remitting tax, what if we shifted that from customs to the online retailer? And I'm sure there was some discussions in the room about, okay, how do we do this? And then also, do we want this to apply to everybody? Yeah. And I think they've recognized that this may not be a burden they want to place on the small sellers. So they put in a threshold of if you're selling more than 75,000 Australian dollars worth of goods into Australia in a year, then you're supposed to register. And then you have to collect the sales tax at checkout and remit that directly to Australia.
So really they were targeting the Amazons of the world, these big market, eBays, right? The big marketplaces that were selling into there. And they had some success with this. I mean, I think it was actually wildly more successful than they thought. I think that the U.S. market is extremely compliant with stuff like this, especially because Wayfair had just come out. And so for merchants that are over that 70,000 a year threshold AUD, they've pretty much been self-reporting.
Yep.
And that's okay. In the US, I would say that's pretty accurate. I say the majority, maybe a little over the majority. I don't know, 50, 60, 70% would be my guess. Who knows? Australia will know at some point, right? Like, so China's a whole nother ball of wax. I don't know how compliant they've been going into Australia, but this was very successful and it started to bleed into other countries. And maybe we get to that in a second. But if you're under 70,000, if you're selling under that 70,000 threshold, then how does it work? Like, does it get collected?
Status quo.
Same
as always. Duty and tax free under 1,000 Australian dollars.
Okay.
So you can still leverage that advantage to make Australia a big market for you until you hit that threshold, and then you have to register and remit.
But unless the exception is if you're using even if you're under that threshold, if you're utilizing a third party as your merchant record service, like Shopify Markets Pro is a classic example, right? Where you can use them and their provider as this merchant of record service. And immediately now you're there.
Yeah, because
you're under their umbrella.
Yep.
So everything you might not have before signing up had any tax getting applied going into Australia, and now you do.
Yep.
Okay. But it's, for the SMB, Australia might not be the one that they have to worry about the most. Right? Wouldn't you say?
Yeah. SMB Australia is going to be something to keep an eye on for.
Well, monitor thresholds. Once you pass it, register, you get your ID. And that's what, I think, you have to obtain what are the steps? Let's go through them real quick. How do you get a,
so you just, it's.
How do you do this if you have to do it?
Here's the great thing about it. Australia, now, laws that have followed in other countries since then aren't as straightforward as Australia. Australia is pretty straightforward. You see, there's some, you monitor your cells. If you hit the threshold, they made a simplified system for anybody outside of Australia to go in and register and get a tax ID. But it's not a full-blown tax ID as if you were an Australian business.
You get the ID, right? It's called an AUS ID, right? An Australian ID through an online service.
Yep.
But then you have to register with that ID for simplified GST.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Then now you can start collecting.
Yep. And it's super straightforward, way simpler than U.S. sales tax. It's 10% GST. And then you start shipping, but on the shipment, you've got to identify that you got your tax ID.
You got your tax ID. So there's some things on the documentation you're supposed to do
too. It's still really, really simple because for customs, for them processing it, if it's under $1,000 they don't do anything. Right. It's really the honor system that it's at the government level. There's somebody, I don't know who's actually doing it, but they're watching sellers and they're watching thresholds. They're using that data and they're going after the big offenders that aren't registered and remitting. And then they're working their way down the list.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So, and on the case of Zonos, and I didn't talk about this with the US, just to let the audience know, like we do help with our landed cost guarantee. We're taking care of all of this, right? Yep. And you don't trigger any threshold issues because we're doing it on your behalf. But we can, calculate, we'll collect it from you, we'll remit it, which is quarterly into Australia, and take care of that. Watch your thresholds by country, or if you're outside the United States, by state into the US. So we're helping do all of this, whether it goes above or below the threshold. And if it goes above 1,000, again, it's just going to go through the normal process. It will be collected at the border.
Yep.
Okay. New Zealand, the neighbor.
Yeah. So
what did the Kiwis do?
Well, they saw that the Aussies were pretty smart and it was pretty successful. So January 1st, 2018 is when this new Australian law rolled out. It was successful enough that by the end of 2019, New Zealand had their own put in place. Theirs is a little different. They got a 60,000 New Zealand dollar threshold. But they didn't do it at the shipment level like Australia did. Australia says, hey, anything, they just matched it up with their de minimis and said, okay, anything under it.
Just the total of the whole shipment, total of the order. Okay.
Yep. Anything under it is on you, retailer. Anything over it's on customs. New Zealand's a little trickier. It's based on the item. So any item under 1,000 New Zealand dollars is considered a low value item. So now you could have a mix of low value and high value items on your shipment. So now you as a retailer have to decide. And the good news is they gave you some options. So
yeah, because it sounded pretty terrible.
Yeah. So what you do is you say, okay, how many low value items am I selling into New Zealand? And I add those up to determine if I'm over that selling threshold. Once I'm over it, then I have to register and remit. Same kind of process as Australia, except now what I collect and remit tax on is the low value items. So technically, one option is to say, okay, I bought some golf shoes and I bought some golf clubs. Okay. Golf shoes are under 1,000 New Zealand dollars. Golf clubs are over.
60,000 New Zealand. No,
sorry. This is on an individual shipment.
Individual shipment.
Right?
Okay. So, all right. Yeah.
So I can collect and remit the GST on the shoes, but not on the clubs. And then I have to identify in all my shipping documentation that tax was already collected on the shoes. So that way customs knows not to do it. Because that shipment's going to be over.
You can do that on a single shipment?
You can. That's an option.
So on a single shipment, you can identify it in line item basis if you're going to pay tax on that line item.
Yep. And then you have to trust that customs isn't going to double assess those taxes.
Oh, geez. Yeah, this is...
So that's a little messy. So our recommendation out of the gate on this one was to use an option they give you, which is just collect GST on all of them. If you got some low value items on it, then just collect and remit GST on everything, including the
golf clubs.
So including the golf clubs in this case.
So you could just put on the documentation.
Yep.
Even though it's over 1,000 NZD, New Zealand dollar, right?
Yep.
That we're gonna self pay our tax going into New Zealand.
And it's this was because the documentation gets much more complex if you don't go this route, and so you can put a big statement on the commercial invoice that says, "Hey, I collected and remitted GST on everything," because a lot of shipping systems don't have the ability to do line item statements on the taxes. Right?
Are there any?
I don't know if you top of my head. So so that's the, and then you still have to watch for double taxation, right? So the good news would be if you send it and send it DDP, so the duty and taxes are billed back to you instead of collected at delivery. And then you just got to watch your back a little bit and make sure that if you get double taxed, then you can adjust for that on the next remittance to make sure you're not paying twice. But so they made it. They added an extra layer of complexity to this whole thing over what Australia did.
Now, was there an option to send two different shipments, or was that never really even a recommendation? It was just, hey, just do it at a line item level. But
yeah, they said line item level.
Do you think anybody's doing that? Like, really? How could that even get pulled off? Like, I can't imagine.
I'm sure somebody is. Yeah.
Yeah, you're probably right. We've seen just about everything. So, don't know how well that would work though. But it does sound like Australia, New Zealand. Some of these are in cooperations. I remember when this came out with other countries to claw back historical revenue if it's non-compliant. We haven't seen a lot of this yet, but I think it's going to be coming down the pike.
Yep, they're going after the big guns first.
Yep. Now, I want to frame something. I'm going to save this question for the end, and I want to summarize all the countries and how much a retailer needs to worry about it by country, depending on the type of retailer. Let's do that in a minute. Now, let's move now to the UK, right? Brexit.
Well, you skipped one that happened before. Norway.
Was anyone paying attention to Norway at this time? Well, we were. Let's talk about Norway.
We were.
Okay, let's talk about Norway.
Well, so this is the beauty of it. Australia's law worked, but do you think anyone is going to copy what Australia did and just say, hey, this is working well? They have to put their own creative flair on this whole thing. And like New Zealand did, make it at the item level instead of the shipment level, which adds a whole nother layer of complexity. And Norway did the same thing.
Yep.
They had to put their own spin on it. So Norway's annual threshold is 50,000 NOK. But Norway's a little smaller market for most retailers, but there's still plenty that end up hitting that threshold. But what they did is they, again, do it at the item level. Okay?
Okay.
So it was 3,000 NOK, an item valued less than 3,000 NOK. Which, what is it? Let's put that into US dollars. That's about 285 US dollars. Okay, so at an item level. So anything valued below that is considered a low value item. So you add those up, it's over 50,000 NOK in a year, then you're supposed to register. Now, they have this scheme called the VOEC scheme.
VAT on e-commerce, I believe, right?
Something like that.
Yep.
That sounds right. So what they do is they say anything. They analyze a shipment, for lack of a better term. They evaluate a shipment and say, okay, is this shipment part of the VOEC scheme? If it checks the boxes that it can be, great. It now the tax is going to be collected and remitted directly, and it will be duty free, which is pretty awesome, right? So the check boxes that need to be for it to be part of the VOEC scheme is the shipper has to say it's part of the VOEC scheme.
On the documentation.
On the documentation, with their tax ID, et cetera.
Right.
We're not going to go into the details of how to do that. That's in our documentation that can be read later. And it's really, it has to be all low value items below, each one has to be valued below 3,000 NOK. And there's certain commodities that are not part of the VOEC scheme. So food items would be a classic example. So if you have anything that's not VOEC compatible, the entire shipment gets kicked out of VOEC scheme. So you know what the recommendation was when they came out with this law?
What's that?
Just split the shipment.
That's the one that wanted to split the shipments. I knew there was one.
Yep. That was a recommendation.
That was a recommendation. Oh boy.
So the cool thing about that is if you split it, then you still get duty-free treatment on the VOEC items.
Yeah.
Right? The downside is you now have to pay shipping twice.
Which for cross-border and an item that's worth, let's say, $300, shipping is probably going to be in that, it could be in the 25 to 50 to plus range.
Depending on what it is.
US dollars is kind of the example here, but
yeah.
it's going to be expensive. And so the determination is, am I going to save on duty as much as I'm going to spend on shipping?
And what about the logic that you have to put into your system to split those shipments when you wouldn't do it at any other country?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I guess if you had a single, just a couple of SKUs and this was a high volume country, I could see maybe somebody trying to game it a little bit, but what a pain.
Yeah.
So how do you make this not a pain?
Well, first off, I want to ask a question. Do you think the lawmakers that came up with this law have worked a day in their life in e-commerce?
No, but then you know what? I bet you the lobbyists that are talking to them also have not worked a day in their life in e-commerce.
Yeah. The practical application of this is just...
No. So much of this is driven in our industry in general, e-commerce, cross-border e-commerce, when the brokers... I'm going to blame brokers. I think when brokers sometimes get involved in these things, they don't understand e-commerce really well. And they want to be everything's compliance, right? It's all about compliant, and there's a de minimis for a reason, and they miss common sense of this is an e-commerce shipment. Like, let's not overthink this. And a lot of this stuff gets overthought because there are some really, really smart people out there that are too smart for their own good. We've worked with some, we know some out there in the industry that, they are smart. And then you say, okay, yeah, that all is true, but it doesn't really apply or shouldn't apply in cross-border e-commerce. Like, this can be so much simpler.
Yep. Well, and here's the other thing let's simplify it. Let's just say, you know what? Forget it. I'm just going to ship everything as one shipment, and whether it's VOEC or not, that's when I'll remit. But you still have to, within your own systems, determine if it's VOEC or not. And so there's extra logic you're going to have to build anyways, but that's
to figure out if that on an individual line item level in an order, do I need to worry about VOEC?
Yep.
Jeez. Okay. So this, man, I thought the last one was complicated. This it feels more complicated. So in the end, how do you make this simple?
Well, use Zonos. That's the easiest way to do it. Use a third party like Zonos because we'll just take care of it for you, right? So, and one thing I want to talk about here is each one it's like we started simple with Australia. It's really the most straightforward one. And then everybody's added their own unique complexity to it. But the good news is all of them have geared this towards online sellers outside the US, and they created a simplified registration system that makes it at least easy for the registration and remittance process. That part has been good up to Norway. And then you want to talk about the UK?
Yep. Now, yes, Brexit.
Okay. And the other side of the simplified is they said, we're not going to make it apply to everybody. We're going to make it simple for the little guys, and the big guys are the only ones that have to register and comply with these. Cool. Makes a lot of sense for e-commerce. Then the UK came along.
Oh, geez.
And they said, we're just going to take our existing tax laws and we're just going to say it applies to everybody in the world that wants to sell anything into the UK. So if you want to sell one box with a t-shirt from your business into the UK, you're supposed to register and remit on anything under 135 pounds.
Pounds.
Right.
Yep.
So if the shipment is valued below 135 British pounds, that's the intrinsic value. So that's just the product value of the goods. Then you're supposed to register and remit that. And then they didn't simplify the registration process. So it's an absolute.
It was like registering as if you were in country. There was no separate process for those outside of their jurisdiction.
No, and the whole process is confusing as
we saw providers that were charging when this came out for one-time registration, like hundreds of dollars, maybe more. I mean, it's been just to get that tax ID, and then you still have the burden of tracking and remitting and doing all that on your own.
Yep. And so it was.
And how long would it take to get the ID?
Oh man, well, it wasn't about getting the ID once you submitted the papers. It was figuring out what the heck they were asking for as you're going through the product, because the terminology and everything they used was confusing it was confusing even for those inside of the UK. But those that were familiar with the system and in the business, they could help you. Outside of that, it was like speaking a foreign language when we first started looking at that. So yeah, the law itself, the actual of when to collect and remit tax, super simple. It's like 135 pounds. There you go. That's your threshold. Anything below, you're supposed to collect and remit. Applies to everybody. There's no threshold to worry about. All that's simpler, but the whole process itself,
making this practical is.
Oh yeah, is
it not there?
Nope.
Nope. Now, what about B2B? Right? I think aren't there some exemptions?
All these laws are really B2C.
Right. There's exemptions for B2B here. But the customer's VAT number, the importer, needs to be included on that commercial invoice.
Yeah. So if you kind of go through all of these, you can still send stuff B2B, and each country's a little different. But yeah, there's some invoicing requirements and things that can come into play. If I look at like New Zealand, for example, they have some I'd say New Zealand, when they rolled out with their law, they had some very detailed instructions, which was awesome. Some of these countries, not so much, but New Zealand actually really thought it out and tried to give instructions on all the different use cases. And B2B was one of those. And they basically said, hey, if you know it's a business, you can just issue them a proper invoice with the tax IDs on it and call it a day, right. Or still collect the tax and let them get a refund on it.
So Norway did it because they're not part of the EU. Right? They were able to kind of unilaterally just do their own thing. This was triggered by Brexit.
Yeah.
100% by Brexit, right?
Yep.
Brexit occurs, and now they're revamping their entire, all of a sudden now they're collecting duty on stuff that's coming in from other European, members, right, members of the EU. And they had to figure out how to get tax, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
100%. And I think the IOS stuff, which we'll talk to next, was already in the works, and the UK had to now come up with their own scheme.
Right.
And they said, we've already got something here. Let's just push it out and make everybody comply with it.
Okay. Should we jump to there?
Yeah, let's go.
Okay. So Norway first. I'm sorry. In this order. Yeah. So we actually Australia, US, New Zealand, Norway hits, UK, Brexit. And now Europe. In Europe, for the European Union, this is IOS. So talk to me about IOS, how it works. Again, it's similar. I think we have the threshold, right? 150 euro above and below. So how is IOS different than UK VAT? Because UK VAT applies to everybody. Does IOS not apply to everybody?
No. The interesting thing about the EU is they just made it optional.
Well,
so there's no threshold. There's no requirement.
I don't have to pay my tax? There's no tax due sometimes? It's
optional? Oh, no. It's what they did they also lowered their thresholds.
Their de minimis threshold. Mm-hmm. Got it.
So it used to be that it was tax-free up to 22 euro.
Yep.
And duty-free up to 150 euro. The duty-free mark stays the same, okay? But what they did is they just abolished the tax de minimis and said, we're going to collect tax on everything, but simultaneously they rolled out this IOS legislation that allowed you to remit that sales tax directly. And there is some advantages to using IOS over not using IOS.
So if I'm a merchant, I have the option to either pay the tax and elect to pay it on my own and get an IOS number, or just let it get handled at the border through the broker customs.
Yep.
Okay. So what are the advantages then? Because, oh, man, I why not just let the customs and the broker take care of this?
Speed of clearance, and reduction in fees. When you're handling it all on your own, it goes through faster, and you're not requiring your broker and customs to do things. So you eliminate all the fees that come along with that process.
Go back to our carrier fee episode.
Exactly.
Talking about some of
so
those
all those go away.
fees into Europe, this can be, especially with express carriers, tens of, US dollars, or tens of euros, right? It can be 10, 15 euros. And that's just gone because, look, it's under the duty de minimis. So I'm just going to remit directly, and I eliminate fees. Now, unless you're using a provider that is charging you a lot of fees to do remittance.
This can be
that,
minimal compared to the carrier fees.
Okay.
Yep. Now, one thing to think of here is there's another part of this legislation that's important to talk to, which makes IOS really important. They changed some of the laws around clearance and how it could be done coming into the European Union. So it used to be that you could clear anywhere and distribute it anywhere within the EU. They made some laws so that way it actually has to clear in the destination country. So it made it so express carriers they could facilitate this fine, some of the bigger players, but you had a lot of consolidators and other players that are very specific to the e-commerce industry that have been clearing in one spot,
like in the Netherlands or something.
Yeah,
they're just clearing into the Netherlands, even though they're shipping to France.
Yep.
Okay.
And so on these, and it's just impacting these low value shipments. And so now all of a sudden they would roll out, hey, if you don't want to use IOS, then they're gonna have to leverage another party, and it's gonna increase the cost.
So massive problem for someone like that.
Or they say you can't ship with us unless you get an IOS number.
Right. Hasn't that been more typical?
That's been more typical
because it's I don't know how they can manage. Seems really difficult to manage a clearance process into France when it's actually clearing through the Netherlands, which is kind of what you're saying, right?
Yeah.
Like they would have to clear through the Netherlands and clear through France to get duties or to get the tax assessed at time of.
And so the costs go up for the services. You can't take advantage of. The main reason you work with those providers is to provide a low cost shipping solution to your shoppers, and that goes out the window unless you're willing to comply with IOS.
The problem would be if you decided, hey, I'm not going to opt into IOS and it's going to the Netherlands. They can't collect. I mean, Netherlands isn't the one that's. They don't have the right to the tax that's for that order because it was paid by someone in France.
Right.
And so, though you could clear it through a traditional method, it's going to just blow up this whole process. What were they doing before this? So, before this came out, and it's, let's say, 30 euro, right? Over the 22, because 22 used to be the tax de minimis, a consolidator that's clearing through the Netherlands, they were probably managing that brokerage price process separately, I would imagine.
Yeah.
So historically, they've actually had a way to do this. It's just this is actually way easier and lower cost for them and their merchants to move to IOS.
Yeah, but the way they were doing it previous to IOS was legal, and then IOS changed some of the rules of the game for the way they clear shipments. And
so it actually did get harder. Mm-hmm. Okay, I didn't realize that.
Yep.
That's fascinating. So IOS is for anyone outside the European Union. So that applies to the UK or Norway or the US or Australia. What about Netherlands to France?
Doesn't impact that. That's OSS. That's a whole other EU thing. That's,
right.
Yep.
So OSS is just kind of intra-state tax management, similar to what inside the United States,
similar
right?
To that,
right. Without spending you could do a whole episode.
Yeah,
probably
OSS. You could consider that a domestic shipment. There's no customs clearance process happening on that transaction because the customs clearance process already happened when it came into the EU.
Yeah. Okay. That's great. Okay. Fascinating. Now, after Europe finished with that, we have a couple other obscure countries. Let's talk about Singapore, and then let's touch on Brazil, and then
Yeah. And we're not touching on all of them. There's some there's some fringe ones out there in like Malaysia and Indonesia, Switzerland and stuff that doesn't impact a lot of people. We're not going to bother talking about today. Okay. Really, those only impact the big players. But Singapore, they came out with their what they call their OVR scheme, and this rolled out the beginning of 2023. So this is fairly young in this game. We're just over a year into this, and this one still does impact mainly just the larger shippers, since Singapore is a relatively small country. You have to sell more than 1,000 Singapore dollars worth of goods. I think the last time I looked, the exchange rate on that was probably around 75,000 USD into Singapore. There's a lot of money in Singapore.
75,000 a year into Singapore, almost similar to the Australian threshold.
Yeah,
which if you're a retailer,
it's actually higher than the Australian threshold.
Yeah. So a U.S. retailer, it's likely they hit that Australian threshold if they do a decent amount of volume. Mm-hmm. But that same retailer probably doesn't have the same percentage of volume going into Singapore. So they would have to be much larger in order to have to worry about this Singapore.
Yeah, and the ones that are going to affect this is, retailers that are probably over in that region of the world are going to have a larger percentage of their shipments going to Singapore than, say, from here in North America.
Yep. So for sure, the big e-commerce retailer, I mean, the big marketplaces, they're dealing with this, and a few select maybe large retailers, but most likely they're inside the region if that's the case, because they're doing a lot of volume into Singapore.
Yep.
Okay. Yep.
So this one is,
and GST there I think is 8% or something like that.
Yeah, and I think it might have just changed to 9. It keeps changing. It's 8 or 9.
Okay.
But I think they kind of turned the heat up, slowly. But it's 9 now. I think it just changed. So the de minimis there is 400. They kept that in place. But the way they determine what's low value, instead of just saying anything below 400, anything above, they actually did it at the item level again, which is, and it's the, but they give you some options, kind of like New Zealand did, which is they can say, hey, at the item level, on either the value of just the item or the value of the item and the CIF value, the value of the item and shipping, or you could just do it at the shipment level. So the default is to say, if you just register for your taxes, the default is, hey, I'm just going to do it at any item below 400 that is of just the item value. So and then you can elect to do something different if you want to.
Okay, so item level is similar to what they were doing in New Zealand, right? And that's their default method, is they're going to do it at the item level.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
What other options you got here?
So another option to say, let's just keep it at the item level, but do it at the CIF value, which is include the shipping costs in it. And that would determine if something's low value.
Why would you do that?
I don't know.
like, wait a second. Why would I increase the value to determine if it's due?
Yeah, that one, I have no idea why someone would use that particular option. There might be a use case out there I'm not thinking of, but that one doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
Because the first one's item level. The second one's item level plus shipping.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know the value.
I'm going to determine if it's
and don't ask. I don't know. If someone's got a good use case out there on that,
I would love to hear. Yep, and leave some comments and explain to us why in the world anyone would do that.
Yep.
Or maybe there's something we're understanding incorrect.
And the simplest option, luckily they give us this one, you can elect to determine if something's a low value shipment instead of item. And you can line it up perfectly with the de minimis, which is 400. And so you can say anything below 400 at a shipment valuation is low value, and any shipment that's above that is not. And it would be just like Australia.
So that's what we recommend. We don't recommend their default. We recommend that they do this. I mean, if you're a retailer, if you're using us, we'll take care of it. We'll handle it this way with the paperwork and do it all correctly. But
we can do it either way. But
if you're out there doing this on your own, that seems like the simplest way to pull this off.
Yeah, the logic to have to do the other ones, we can support those. But one of the reasons why I really like the electing to just do it at the shipment level is because it makes it really simple for customs too. You eliminate the possibility of getting double taxation, right? Because customs is already trained
Yeah.
That if it's below 400, I don't do anything. They don't assess anything. If it's over, they have to really do some work to assess it, and you line it up perfectly with that. And versus the other ones where you do it at the item level, you could have a shipment over the de minimis, and now you're relying on customs to recognize that they shouldn't assess when they do assess on pretty much every other shipment. So I think either one will work. You just have to watch your back a little more if you do the item level stuff to make sure you're not getting double taxed.
Double taxed. All right. Which is always fun. We've seen that happen out there. So let's talk a bit about Brazil, right?
Yeah.
So the other day I remember we had a brasileiro, a Brazilian, reach out, right? And just someone on our website, right, left a comment saying, "Hey, your de minimis is wrong, right? It's actually 50 USD, I think is what." So why would he say that? And what is going on in Brazil? And because our documentation is correct, but what's the confusion here? Why are Brazilians familiar with this? And what's been the change there with their laws?
Yeah, so it depends on the de minimis, on who it's coming from. Typically B2C shipments, there is no de minimis. They charge duty and tax on everything. But if it's coming in, if grandma's sending something in the post to grandson in Brazil, there is a $50 de minimis on that type of shipment.
Okay.
Well, what's been happening in Brazil over the years is there's been certain companies that sell a lot of low-value goods in a certain country that have been leveraging that and making their shipments look like it's coming from a person-to-person, coming through the postal channel, and they've been leveraging that de minimis.
C2C. Mm-hmm. They're pretending they're C2C. They've been leveraging the maybe this is why the person thought they had a $50 de minimis, right? They're leveraging that. Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. So what Brazil's rolled out, I mean, we'll touch on this one briefly, but it's a little more complex in a number of different ways. But it's optional to do this, so it's kind of like iOS in that regard. You can get registered for it, but the registration and the remittance is totally different. Instead of just having an online portal where you go and remit every month or every quarter like the other countries, you actually have to involve your logistics provider, your carrier, in this, and you actually have to show contract that you're using an approved provider, and they're actually helping to facilitate the movement of that money. And it's done. The remittance and payment is actually done as the transactions are happening, not batching them up every month or quarter. And then the advantage of this is a couple of advantages: faster clearance, just like kind of all the other ones. That $50 de minimis is in play for the duty, which is on personal shipments. The duty is 60%. And so they have a standardized duty rate,
simplified regime for anything under it's what, at 3,000 USD.
3,000 USD, and if it's a consumer buying it, it's a flat 60% duty. So massive.
It's a huge savings if you are under the 50 threshold.
$50. Yep. And then they standardize the tax rate too. They have varying tax rates across all their states / provinces. And it can usually vary between 17 and 19, but they said you can use the 17%, which is the lowest rate for all of your shipments. So that's cool. You get to save a little bit on taxes as well. And by the way, they do some funky math on their taxes, which we won't really go into here. That 17% is probably closer to 20% for the way everyone else applies a tax, but not to dive into all the nuances of the way they do that. But that's... So there's a lot of hoops to go through. The registration process is cumbersome and takes a while. But if you're a big retailer, it can make a lot of sense.
Okay. Hey, I'd like to finish up by doing a rapid fire questions. Okay.
Oh boy.
For you. All right.
Oh boy.
Yes or no? If I'm gonna list the country.
I need to sip on some Red Bull.
Yes. Get ready for this. I will give you the country, and then I will say,
"Is I don't
small
know
retailer."
Is I don't know a valid response?
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
A small retailer, do they need to worry about the okay. Should a small retailer be worried into this country in general? And then I'll ask for a large retailer. Should they be worried into this country? Right.
Okay.
And I'll go through each country. Okay.
Okay. Now, if we're going to just do yes or no, the caveat to any small retailers, when they start becoming a big retailer, they still have to watch their selling thresholds in the countries. Okay.
So small retailer, meaning they're doing probably under 100 shipments a month in total as a company, right? Cross-border, right? They're maybe even under 50, right? It's let's use that as a categorization. Is that fair?
Yep.
Large, at a zero, right? We're talking maybe upwards of 1,000 a month or 500. So we'll kind of put in that category. It's not perfect, but let's just roll with it. Because what I would like to do is walk away with, well, first, we can help with a lot of this, but second, if you're doing this on your own, like where do you really need to worry and where do you not need to worry? Okay. US, inbound.
No.
Small retailer.
No.
Large retailer?
Yeah.
Australia, small retailer.
No.
Large retailer?
Yep.
New Zealand, small retailer.
No.
Large retailer.
Yep.
UK, small retailer.
Yep.
Large retailer.
Yep.
Yeah. Europe, small retailer.
Yeah. Worth paying attention to.
Yeah. Large retailer?
Yep.
Of course. Norway, small retailer.
No.
Large retailer?
Yep.
Singapore, small retailer.
No.
Large retailer.
Yes.
Brazil, small retailer.
No.
Yeah. Large retailer.
Yeah, it's worth paying attention
Maybe.
to.
Right. Yeah. Okay. I don't think I missed any country, but hopefully this was a insightful episode on low value tax schemes for cross-border e-commerce, and appreciate the insights. This one was a little bit outside of my comfort zone.
I want to get you a question.
Oh boy. I was just saying this is outside of my comfort zone. Like
I know, but I'm gonna give you a question.
Let's do it.
All right. So if we look here, if you rewind 6 years to when Australia came out with their law, pretty easy to say, yeah, everybody else is going to be this, it's going to come through on my duty and tax bill from a carrier. That's how we're going to handle, duty and tax payment. Australia came out and it was just pretty simple and straightforward. Managing one country is an exception, no big deal. But now that list is grown and the rules are all different for every country. So now it's way more complex for an e-commerce merchant to keep track of it all. But do you think we're done?
No way. This is just getting started. Think about this. We were talking about this on our way in. Wayfair and Australia, this is only 6 years old. In the history of global trade, low value e-commerce goods, we're only 6 years into this.
Yep.
We are just getting started, and every year it's going to change. At first, it made sense maybe for a retailer to do it on their own in Australia and figure it out. It is really hard to do this now at scale on your own for even large companies. We're talking with, we work with one of the largest exporters for DHL and FedEx in the United States, possibly their largest. And they've just passed this all to us because of the complexity and risk that they've had with just dealing with not just the tax laws, but also just the payment of duty and tax. And I mean, what we do know is tax laws are getting more complicated, but just global trade in general, duty rates are changing, countervailing duties, all of that, like that's just going to get worse and worse. So it never gets easier. It only gets harder. But this is fun, right? Like this is exciting stuff, right? For us,
yep.
For everybody else, they're like, look, I just want to sell internationally and not worry about all these different things. And I think this episode is partially for some of those retailers out there, sure, like the ones that are hardcore and want to understand it. But it's really for a lot in the logistics industry, I think, to understand what the retailers are going through and where they have to worry. And hopefully we delivered some good nuggets for the audience today.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, next time we'll surprise you with a new episode and some new jokes. Thanks, Aaron.
All right.